Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's session on developing a FOSS policy. Looking forward to sharing insights with you about this very exciting but often overlooked area in organizations. So let me just start off by sharing my screen. Okay, it should pop up shortly. Okay, great. So what you should see on your screen now is the slides for developing a FOSS policy, and we're going to get started. So what will you get from today's session? You'll get an understanding of what FOSS means, free and open source software. You'll also recognize why you need to have a policy in place. And this really is a formal policy to guide and govern FOSS within your organization. Then you'll get a brief understanding of the components of the policy and how the policy needs to be implemented. And then there'll be benefits advantages and disadvantages discussed so FOSS, as well as some suggestions on getting started within that space. But I'd like to start off, as usual, with the context for free and open source software. And this requires me to paint a bit of historical background for you, but I'll keep it brief. And really, it's that in the commercial software space, traditionally, software, and particularly on-premise software, which consists of code, really was restricted from an intellectual property perspective. So it was pretty restrictive. Only the IP, the intellectual property owner, could actually commercialize the technology, access it, and otherwise it would be covered by applicable IP laws like trade secret laws, for example. And so, and which was great for those who own software. But then there was this movement towards open sourcing, where essentially the components of the software, or the source code at least, was made publicly available, not necessarily freely, but publicly available. And the idea was, with this move to open source software, organizations would really, and people will benefit from access to technology that's regularly reviewed and updated. However, there are also concerns relating to licensing requirements, which we'll get into a bit later. So the gist of it, to understand, is that we had this approach where software was sort of, the focus of the software was keeping the software, keeping the IP rights pretty restrictive, and fees being paid essentially for software. And then there was this move to open source software. But what exactly is FOSS? As I said, it stands for free and open source software. And it's really software that gives users the freedom to use, study, change, and distribute the software and its source code for any purpose or for specific purposes. And the idea was, this freedom sort of created a collaborative environment where developers across the world could interact and build on the same software, or its code at least, and contribute to that software's resilience at the end of the day. Now, there are benefits to using FOSS, and then there are disadvantages. Some of the benefits include cost savings that organizations would typically need to employ when licensing expensive software, like from organizations that hold the IP. It also leads to significant cost reductions for that case. And then there's also flexibility. So many FOSS licenses allow you to actively customize the software to meet your organization's specific requirements, which gives you effectively more control and adaptability. And then on a security side, it's really the open source code allows for greater scrutiny by the community. So whoever's working on it can address the can identify and address the vulnerabilities in the software code as it goes along. So from one perspective, to when we speak about your organization's tech stack or software stack, varying or alternating, or imagine a collage and it consists of different pictures. You could think of software in that way. When you're in your organization's tech stack, it could consist of both proprietary and open source software, creating security resilience effectively over there. And then also FOSS is transparent. So because it's publicly available, because it's scrutinized regularly, it encourages its transparency contributes to the fact that it could be regularly trusted. And then there's also access to a community of knowledge. But FOSS does come with its disadvantages. There is a steep learning curve for those who are just getting started. But not only those getting started and using the software, but also following, from a compliance perspective at least, understanding the implications of using the software. And then also think of it this way as well. Your organization would typically have its existing tech stack and would want to consider using free and open source software. However, because of the type of software that you may already be using, the FOSS may not be compatible or easily integratable with the existing tech stack or with the software that you've licensed from other service providers. In fact, a lot of software license agreements, when you license software from a provider or OEM, would typically not allow you to combine their software with open source software because of the risk of losing its proprietary protection over there, which is worthwhile keeping in mind. And then also from a support perspective, the formal, when you buy or license proprietary software, you'd normally complement that software with support and maintenance services from that organization or an organization that typically implements the software. Now, those formal support mechanisms are not necessarily readily available when it comes to free and open source software, and resolving issues typically takes a longer time. And then also the sustainability, because there are limited resources or limited people working or who understand how to effectively implement it, it can create challenges in the medium to long term. But what we can agree, though, is that FOSS is increasingly playing a role across various sectors. The penetration rate is very high for FOSS. It's being adopted by governments, educational institutions, businesses across the globe, healthcare organizations, technology organizations. For example, they may use Linux, the Linux system, various web services and cloud services platforms. However, it's vital if your organization is wanting to start or explore its FOSS journey, or explore FOSS as part of its journey, that it considers the use cases and the implications of that. That's really what we do, what we help with. We examine the software as well as put the right frameworks in place for you to leverage it safely, lawfully, and profitably. But why do we need a FOSS policy, really? And if you were in one of the previous sessions, you would have noted that I often distinguish between policies, plans, and procedures. So policies are really about focusing on setting the direction in which your organization wants to head in, whereas plans are steps to achieving those goals set out in the strategy document, which is your policy, and it may consist of procedures, which is answering the question of how as well. But if you don't have a FOSS policy in place, in other words, you don't set strategic direction on how it can be used, it can expose you to many challenges that could impact your ops, your operations, your risk profile, and I'll give some examples. So the different teams that work with the FOSS may not be aware of the compatibility issues, and evaluate the technical requirements of the software to actually check if they match your organization's needs. It also may create dependencies that you would be unaware of. Then a very big concern, which I've mentioned briefly, is the licensing concerns. So each piece of free or open source software generally comes with licensing terms, such as Apache licensing terms, the MIT licensing terms, what's slipping my mind now, but it's the common, Creative Commons licenses. And each of those license terms contain unique approaches to effectively engage with that specific software. So, for example, one open source license may say, yes, you can use the software, you can use it freely available, you can use it for whatever you want to, commercial or non-commercial perspectives, or commercial or non-commercial reasons. However, if you take the software and you improve on it or combine it with other software, that the source code of that combined or collaborated software needs to be made publicly available. Or it could say that you can't prevent someone else from having access to that combined software, or it loses its IP protection, etc. And so really it's led to quite a few disputes on ownership of software, and so it really needs to be kept in mind. And then also, while FOSS can enhance your organization's security posture, it could equally create security risks, where for example, there may be unknown vulnerabilities, or if you use outdated versions of FOSS software. That's why we typically advise organizations to also have a FOSS register. I'll send you links for these in the chat afterwards. But really, the need to have it is to provide clarity, to provide consistency, and to provide direction. Just have a look to see if there are any questions or comments as yet. No, so we're good. And then I thought it would be worth just briefly saying that, where does FOSS happen in your organization? What part of your existing organizational process does it form part of? And really, in an organization that develops its own software, or that gets other people to develop its software, or even if they purchase off-the-shelf solutions, your organization or your vendors would typically follow what's known as the software development lifecycle, which starts from defining the scope of the project, creating the architecture and designing the solution, developing it, integrating it into your tech stack, as well as your existing processes, and testing them, and then ongoing support and maintenance. Now, this is the broader picture, and FOSS will fit in this development life cycle. However, it's the compliance side of it needs to be dealt with by your compliance teams, your legal teams, your GRC teams, etc. So this is really the I'd say the life cycle within which you can view how FOSS is typically used in an organization. So moving along, let's break down the core components of a typical FOSS policy. So we'll start off with the definition and scope. And so it's important clearly to define FOSS clearly and specifically with regards to your organization and its needs. Now, typically, I advise organizations to follow the definitions of free and open source software as provided by the Open Source Software Initiative. However, you can take a bespoke approach if you want to, but you need to understand the risks of doing so. And then from a scope perspective, you'd really specify which departments or projects the policy applies to. Now, this is key because you'd think typically that it would be your software development team that would only be needing to follow this policy. But essentially, it should be applying to all of your employees, because from a risk perspective, often with free and open source software, it's very difficult to control licensing or determining whether an employee is using FOSS software or FOSS. And because of that risk that is inherent to FOSS, and the fact that it's so easy to access, easy to use, easy to download, organizations need to be very clear on that it applies to everyone if that is the case, or to just a specific group of people. Now, when it comes to acquisition and use, really that's the stage where the policy addresses the procedures or steps that need to be followed when someone within the organization would like to acquire or use FOSS. And these would be steps from procuring the actual software to the software being evaluated by, for example, the legal and technical teams in your organization, to getting the version numbers, the licensing terms, etc., and checking whether it aligns with the organization's risk appetite, and then also the specific use cases for that your organization wishes to allow FOSS, or not wishes, but intends for FOSS to specifically provide a role in. And so you should really outline this process. It's more step by step, and address issues such as licensing compliance, compatibility with existing systems, and then as well as the InfoSec considerations that I mentioned early on. From a development and contribution perspective, it's also worth considering what open source projects your devs could contribute to. It would be to explain the guidelines or set out the guidelines for when devs may use open source software. And I mean, I'm not use it, but rather integrate it within the system and set guidelines or principles for that. And then also addressing the issues such as intellectual property rights, licensing, community engagement, because you'd want to ensure at least that if you are adopting a particular FOSS, for a particular project, that it is sustainable for your organization. And then lastly, dealing with support and maintenance. So as I mentioned, typically FOSS doesn't have the robust support and maintenance that proprietary software like SAP or Cisco or another proprietary solutions provider would have. And so you would need to describe the procedures or the steps that the acquirer of FOSS needs to follow, and also indicate what their plan is to address things like bugs, software updates, dealing with updates, and the long-term sustainability of adopting that particular piece of FOSS. From an implementation perspective, so you have your policy, you've drafted it, you've actually got the approvals, it's been signed off. Now, what does implementation look like? Many organizations struggle with this component. They think that, or the assumption rather, is that we have a policy, we've ticked the box, great, it's done. But that often doesn't work out because it doesn't bring the policy to the people. And so implementing a FOSS policy really requires that you communicate that you actually have the policy. I know it seems like common sense, but common sense doesn't. Common sense sort of falls out of the window in organizations. And then also the educational training side of it. So it's important to communicate the why behind the policy to all stakeholders. And this may include your vendors, so it may need to become part of your third-party risk management process. And then training, obviously. When it comes to compliance and enforcement, here I mean that your personnel need to set the expectations with your personnel that if they don't follow the policy, that they could face disciplinary action. And the reason for this is that the consequences of FOSS being integrated into your tech stack and then potentially interfering with the licensing of your proprietary software, the risk of that happening is quite material and significant for an organization. I mean, they could lose an entire line of business based on that. And so you'd want to be pretty robust with compliance and enforcing the policy. And so really you need someone to champion this area of the work. And ideally, it should consist of that team basically should consist of someone from IT, someone from legal, and then someone from learning development as well. And enforcement also really would address the issues such as monitoring, auditing, and so forth. Coming to the end now is when do you need to review and update your FOSS policy? And really it's whenever you can set timelines in the policy, or there are significant changes, or a new venture or new part of business that you want to engage with that involves significant FOSS. Changes in the risk approach, changes in market conditions, if you've been acquired or want to be acquired, if you want to acquire another business, because typically from an M&A perspective, a specialist would come in and the organization would want to buy the organization, or buy your organization, or what organization you would like to buy, would add a risk rating to not having FOSS policies in place or having a centralized place where that information lies. But equally so, they'll add a financial value to that compliance. So it may, and typically what happens in the M&As is if you don't have these compliance structures, this governance in place, they would deduct the risk of non-compliance from the value of the entire deal. So it's worth considering. And while there isn't a formal legal framework for FOSS, if there are specific laws, copyright laws, laws that apply from a cybersecurity perspective, really speaking to for software generally, that software would include FOSS, and then from an electronic communications perspective as well. And then also what's worth considering from a broader agile regulation perspective is the ISO standard on open source licensing. And it really plays a key role in setting up a FOSS program within your organization. But we've come to the end of today's session, and really the point of today was really to help you understand free and open source software, to understand that you need a policy if you are going to be engaging with FOSS. Drafting that, what the typical components are, how to implement, and be motivated to act to effectively get that in place. I hope you enjoyed today's session. If there are any questions, feel free to